The lawyer read my father-in-law's will out loud in the great drawing room of a house I was about to learn I owned. And when he came to the line about me, the whole family smiled. To my daughter's husband, the lawyer read, in the dry, careful voice of a man who knows he is delivering an insult and has decided it is not his business to soften it. I leave nothing, as he has always been so very proud of making his own way. And the Ellsworths, all of them, my mother-in-law Genevieve with her spine like a fireplace poker, my brother-in-law Bradford with his soft hands that had never held a tool, my sister-in-law Cordelia with her practiced little laugh, they smiled, some of them openly, because even from beyond the grave Edmund Ellsworth had found a way to remind the room that the plumber who had married his daughter was not, and would never be, one of them. My wife Kate reached for my hand under the table, her face gone white with the old familiar shame, 28 years of it, and I squeezed her hand and I kept my face still, because I had learned a long time ago how to keep my face still in that house. Stay with me, because what none of them knew, as they smiled at the plumber being cut out of the great Ellsworth fortune one last time, was that there was no Ellsworth fortune. It had been gone for years. The house they were sitting in, the ancestral estate they were about to divide among themselves, the very name they wore like a crown, all of it had been quietly kept alive for a decade by the one man in that room they had never once treated as family. Me. I held the mortgage on Graymore. I had held it for 10 years. The people smiling at my humiliation were living in a house I owned, and they were about to find out. My name is Joe Marchetti. I started out as a plumber, and I want to say that plainly and without a shred of apology because the word plumber is the whole hinge of this story. It is the word the Ellsworths used behind my back for 28 years, the plumber, the way you'd say the help, and I wore it the way you wear a name people mean as an insult, which is to say I decided a long time ago to make it mean the opposite of what they intended. I am going to tell you the whole of this, from the wedding where it started to the reckoning where it ended, because I think there are a great many of us out there, the ones who married up, the ones a family decided were beneath them, the ones seated at the far end of every table and left off every list, and I think you deserve to hear how one of us kept his dignity for 28 years under a contempt that never once let up, and what happened on the day the people who looked down on him discovered who had actually been holding them up the whole time. So let me start at the beginning with a girl named Kate, and the best decision I ever made, and the family that made me pay for it for the rest of their lives. I met Kate Ellsworth when I was 26 years old and running my own small plumbing business, 3 trucks and a handful of guys, working myself half to death, and I met her because I was called out to fix a burst pipe at a charity event her family's foundation was hosting. And I came up from the flooded basement soaked to the elbows to find the most beautiful woman I had ever seen laughing at the sight of me, not cruelly, the way her family would later laugh, but with delight, and she said, "You just saved this entire party, do you know that?" And I said something stupid, and she laughed again, and that was it. That was the whole of my life, decided in a flooded basement in ruined work clothes. I asked her to dinner right there, dripping, and she said yes, and I spent the next 2 weeks certain I'd imagined it, that a woman like that could not possibly have meant it, and then we had that dinner and then 100 more, and I learned who Kate actually was, which was not an Ellsworth in any way that counted. She had grown up in that cold gilded house, starving for exactly the thing I'd grown up surrounded by, which was warmth, ordinary human warmth, in short supply at Graymore and in endless supply in a cramped apartment run by a cleaning woman with 4 kids and a full heart. The first time I brought Kate home to meet my mother, in our small apartment with the mismatched chairs, Kate cried, and I panicked, thinking something was wrong, and she said, "Nothing's wrong. It's just so warm in here. I didn't know houses could feel like this." And that was when I understood that for all their money, the Ellsworths were the poor ones, poor in the way that actually matters, and that Kate had spent her whole life shivering in a mansion and had walked into a plumber's apartment and finally felt warm. She wasn't marrying down. She was marrying toward the only thing she'd never had. Her family could never understand that because they had mistaken their coldness for refinement for so many generations that they could no longer tell the difference. But Kate understood it, and I understood it, and it was the one true thing all their contempt could never touch, because you cannot make a person ashamed of the warmth that saved them no matter how long you try, and they tried for 28 years. Kate is the reason for every good thing in this story. I would have walked away from the Ellsworths and their contempt after the very first meeting in Edmund's study, would never have subjected myself to a single one of those 28 years except for her, and I would do all of it again, every dinner at the far end of the table, every cold Christmas, for her, because a love like that is not something you get to have and also keep your comfort. You have to choose over and over, and I chose her over my pride 10,000 times, and it was the easiest math I ever did. Kate was an Ellsworth, which meant nothing to me at the time because I didn't know what an Ellsworth was, and everything to her family because being an Ellsworth was, as far as I could ever tell, the only thing any of them had ever actually accomplished. But Kate was not like them. That is the thing you have to understand, or none of the rest makes sense. Kate had been born into that cold, gilded family and had somehow come out warm, and she saw me, the plumber with the wet sleeves, and she saw a man, an actual man, which was more than her family ever managed in 28 years of trying not to. We fell in love fast and hard, and when I asked her to marry me, she said yes before I finished the question, and then she took me home to meet her family, and I got my first education in what the rest of my life was going to feel like. The Ellsworths lived and still live at Graymore, an estate that has been in the family for 4 generations, a great stone house at the end of a long drive, with a name and a history and a portrait gallery of dead Ellsworths looking down their painted noses at everyone who walks through. And I want you to understand that walking into Graymore for the first time in my one good jacket to ask for the hand of the girl I loved was like walking onto the surface of a colder planet. Edmund Ellsworth, Kate's father, received me in his study, and he did not stand up, and he did not shake my hand, and he looked at me the way you look at something the dog dragged in, and he asked me a series of questions about my prospects that were designed, each one, to establish that I had none that mattered to a man like him, and at the end of it he said, and I have never forgotten a single word of it, he said, "Catherine has always had a taste for the unusual. I assume this will pass. But if it does not, understand that marrying my daughter does not make you family. It makes you her husband. Those are not the same thing, and in this house you will never confuse them." I was 26. I had come to ask for his blessing. And he told me, before I had done anything at all except love his daughter, that I would never be family. He was right about one thing. It never did pass. And he spent the next 28 years making sure I never once forgot the rest. We got married anyway. Kate defied them, which cost her more than I understood at the time, because for a woman raised in that world, choosing me was choosing exile, a slow, quiet exile that her family administered in 1,000 small doses over the decades, and she chose it for me, and I have spent my whole life trying to be worth what she gave up. The wedding itself was the second lesson. Her family came because not coming would have been a scandal, and the Ellsworths feared scandal more than they feared God. But they came the way you attend a funeral for someone you didn't like, and Edmund gave a toast, if you can call it that, a short, cold speech in which he never said my name, not once, referred to me only as Catherine's young man, and managed to make the entire room understand, through nothing but tone and the things he didn't say, that his daughter was marrying beneath herself and that the family was enduring it. The two sides of that wedding hall told the whole story of everything that would come after, if anyone had known how to read it. On one side sat the Ellsworths and their people, beautifully dressed, correct, cold, applauding Edmund's toast with the polite restraint of people attending an event slightly beneath them, checking their watches, making their small superior remarks behind their hands. And on the other side sat my people, my mother and my brothers and my aunts and uncles, plumbers and electricians and nurses and mechanics and cleaning women, loud, warm, overdressed in their best, which was not much, crying openly with joy, laughing too loud, dancing badly and without a shred of self-consciousness, so happy for me, so full of the kind of life the Ellsworth side had refined itself right out of. And I remember standing between the two rooms that were really two worlds and understanding, even young, which side had the actual wealth, because one side was rich in money and poor in everything else, and the other was poor in money and rich in the only things money was ever supposed to buy and never can. Kate spent the whole reception on my side of the hall, in the warmth, dancing with my uncles, being hugged by my aunts, and her own family watched her choose the warm, poor room over the cold, rich one with thin, disapproving smiles, and they never understood that she was showing them, right there at her own wedding, everything they needed to know. My people welcomed Kate that day like she'd always been one of us. No questions, no probation, just here is Joe's girl. She's family now. Come here, sit down, eat. Her people spent 28 years making sure I understood I would never be family. That contrast, drawn so clearly on a single afternoon, is the whole of what I learned about where real richness lives. My mother, God rest her, a cleaning woman who had raised 4 kids alone after my father died, sat through that toast with her hands folded in her lap and her chin up, and afterward she took my face in her hands and she said, "Giuseppe, you listen to me. That man has more money than us and less class than the man who parks the cars. Don't you ever let him make you feel small. Small is a thing you agree to. Don't agree." I never forgot that either. My mother, the cleaning woman, understood something about dignity that 4 generations of Ellsworths never learned, which is that it is not a thing you inherit or purchase, it is a thing you carry, and that the people most obsessed with looking down on others are almost always standing on the thinnest possible ground. Let me tell you about my mother, because she is the spine of this whole story, even though she died before the reckoning, and because everything I did in that drawing room I did because of her. Her name was Antonia, and she came to this country with nothing, and she married my father, a pipe fitter, a good man who died of a heart attack on a job site when I was 11, and after that my mother raised 4 children alone by cleaning other people's houses on her knees, scrubbing floors in homes not so different from Graymore, homes owned by families not so different from the Ellsworths. And she did it without ever once bending her spine, because my mother had made a distinction early in her life that most people never make, the distinction between her situation and her worth, and she refused, absolutely refused, to let anyone collapse the two. She cleaned the houses of people who treated her as furniture, and she came home and she held her head up, and she taught her children that the family scrubbing the floor and the family sitting on the sofa were exactly equal in the only ledger that mattered, and that anyone who thought otherwise was revealing the smallness of their own soul, not the truth of yours. I watched my mother be condescended to my entire childhood, by people who had more money and less character than she did, and I watched her never once, not one single time, accept their estimate of her, and it was the greatest education a man could have, because it meant that when I married into a family that spent 28 years trying to make me feel like the help, I had already been inoculated decades earlier by a woman on her knees with a scrub brush and a spine of iron. The Ellsworths thought they were teaching me my place. They had no idea they were up against Antonia Marchetti, who had taught me before I was 12 that my place was wherever I chose to stand, chin up, and that no one gets to assign it to you unless you agree. She died 2 years before Edmund. I wish she had lived to see it, but in a way she did see it because she was in that room with me the whole time, in the voice I heard when Bradford handed me the glass and when the lawyer said my name. Small is a thing you agree to, don't agree, and I never did, Mama, I never once agreed, and it was all because of you. Let me tell you about the 28 years, quickly, because the texture of it matters, the daily grind of being not quite family in a family that never let you forget it. It was never one big thing. The Ellsworths were far too refined for one big thing. It was 10,000 small things, each one deniable, each one too small to object to without looking petty, which is exactly how that kind of contempt works. It hides in the space between what was said and what was meant. It was being introduced at their events as Kate's husband, Joe, and then watching the introducer turn away before I could extend my hand, so that the introduction was really a dismissal. It was Bradford, my brother-in-law, who had never worked a day in his life and lived entirely on the dwindling family money, asking me at every holiday with a little smile, "How's the pipe business, Joe?" For 28 years, as if I fixed toilets for pocket change, when the truth, which he never bothered to learn, was that I had built one of the largest mechanical contracting firms in the region. It was Genevieve, my mother-in-law, who in 28 years never once, not one single time, invited me anywhere using my name, only ever Catherine and her husband. It was the seating at every family dinner, always at the far end, always next to whoever mattered least. Christmas was the worst of it. Every year, a masterclass in exquisite exclusion. The Ellsworths did Christmas at Graymore the way they did everything, as a performance of a heritage, and every year there was a moment I came to dread, the giving of the gifts, because the family had a tradition of thoughtful, personal, expensive gifts for one another, gifts that said, "I know you, I see you, you are one of us," and every year my gift, if there was one at all, was an afterthought, a gift card, a bottle of something generic, the gift you give the mailman chosen to communicate precisely the distance they intended. And every year I watched Kate's face as she watched me open it, watched her absorb the small annual reminder that her husband was not, in her family's accounting, a person worth actually knowing. One year Bradford, as a joke, gave me a gift-wrapped plunger. Everyone laughed. I laughed too because the alternative was to let them see it land, and I would not, but I have never forgotten the sound of that laughter, my wife's family laughing at a plunger given to the plumber at Christmas, in a house I had, by then, already saved from foreclosure with money none of them knew about. I took that plunger home. I still have it, actually, in my garage. I kept it all these years, not out of bitterness, but as a kind of relic, a reminder of exactly who those people were and exactly what I chose not to become. And there were moments in that drawing room, holding the deed to their world, when I thought about that plunger and the laughter, and I will not pretend the memory didn't argue for foreclosure. But I kept the plunger and I kept my dignity, and in the end I kept both by not becoming the kind of man who'd put an old woman in the street over a Christmas joke, however cruel. The plunger's still in my garage. Bradford's still Bradford. I know which of us came out of it the richer man, and it has nothing to do with the money. It was the seating at every family dinner, always at the far end, always next to whoever mattered least. It was the way they talked about their world, the schools and the clubs and the names, in a code designed to remind me at all times that I was not fluent in it and never would be. I'll give you one of the 10,000 because it's the one I think about most, and it will show you the exact flavor of it. About 15 years into the marriage, the family hosted a big anniversary party for Edmund and Genevieve at their country club, the kind of place with a waiting list you can't buy your way onto and a dress code with opinions, and I wore my best suit, a good one, and I was standing with a drink when an older gentleman, a friend of Edmund's, mistook me for the staff and handed me his empty glass and asked for another scotch. It was an honest mistake. The man was old and I was standing near the bar, and I'd have thought nothing of it, except that Bradford was standing right there, and Bradford saw the whole thing, and instead of correcting it, instead of saying, "Oh, that's my sister's husband," Bradford let it happen, and then, as I stood there holding a stranger's empty scotch glass at my own in-laws' anniversary, Bradford smiled that soft smile and said, "Better get him his drink, Joe," and turned back to his conversation. And I had a choice, and I made it. I walked to the bar, and I got the old man his scotch, and I brought it to him, and he thanked me kindly because he was a decent man who'd simply made a mistake, and I never let Bradford see that it touched me, because letting him see would have been agreeing to be small, and I would not agree. But I remember the weight of that empty glass in my hand to this day, because it was the whole marriage in one object, the assumption, casual and total, that I was there to serve them, and Bradford's soft delight in it, and my own decision to keep my dignity by refusing to perform the wound. Bradford told that story for years, the time Joe played waiter, never once understanding that in that entire room, the only person who'd behaved with any actual class was the plumber holding the empty glass. And it was the way, as the years went on, they extended the same cool condescension to my daughter, to Lucy, my Lucy, who was half Ellsworth and half Marchetti, and whom they treated as though the Marchetti half were a stain to be politely overlooked, and that, I will tell you, was the only thing in 28 years that ever made me want to burn that whole cold house down, because a man can take contempt for himself, he chooses to take it, but watching them look down on his child is a different thing entirely, and it is the thing I came closest to never forgiving. There was one afternoon with Lucy that I have never gotten over. She was about 9, and the family was at Graymore for some occasion, and I came looking for her and found her standing alone at the bottom of the grand staircase, looking up at the portrait gallery, at all the painted Ellsworths, and she was crying quietly, the way a child cries when they've decided the hurt is their fault and shouldn't be shown. And I asked her what was wrong, and it took a while, but finally she told me that her cousins, Bradford's kids, had told her she wasn't a real Ellsworth, that she was only half, that her daddy was just the plumber, and that the portraits were of real family and she'd never be up there. 9 years old, and I knelt down at the bottom of that staircase, under all those painted noses, and I took my daughter's face in my hands the way my mother once took mine, and I said, "Lucy, look at me. You listen to your papa. You see all those people in those paintings? Not one of them ever built a single thing. Not one of them ever fixed anything or made anything or helped anybody at 3 in the morning. They just got born and got their picture painted and looked down on people. That's the whole of what they did. Now your grandmother, my mother, scrubbed floors so her kids could eat with her head held high, and she was worth every one of those people in those frames put together. And you are her granddaughter, and you have her in you, and that is a far, far better thing to be than an Ellsworth on a wall. Don't you ever cry at the bottom of these stairs again. You hold your head up in this house because the people who built something real are always, always worth more than the people who only ever inherited it. You promise me." And she promised me, and she wiped her face, and she walked up those stairs with her chin up, 9 years old, past all the portraits, and I watched her go and I thought my heart would break with love and rage in equal measure. That is the day I came closest to walking away from all of it. And it is also, I understand now, the day that planted in me the thing that would not let me merely forgive the Ellsworths at the end, because a man can forgive what was done to him, but the account of what was done to his child stays open a great deal longer and settles a great deal harder. Now let me tell you what the Ellsworths were underneath the name and the house and the portraits, because it is the secret at the center of everything, and it is a secret I learned before any of them and kept for 10 years for my wife's sake. The Ellsworths were broke. Not broke the way you and I might use the word. Broke in the particular, hidden, catastrophic way that old families go broke, slowly, over generations, as a great fortune made by some distant hardworking ancestor is spent and spent and spent by descendants who never made a dime themselves and never learned how, who lived on the principle and called it living on the income, who mistook the slow draining of a reservoir for a permanent spring. By the time I married Kate, the Ellsworth fortune was already a ghost, though they didn't behave like it and perhaps didn't fully believe it. The family firm, an old investment house that Ellsworths had run for a century, was a hollow shell coasting on reputation. The estate, Graymore, that great stone monument to their superiority, was a money pit that devoured cash they no longer had. And the whole magnificent edifice of Ellsworth grandeur was, by the time I came along in my one good jacket, a beautiful facade held up by pride, debt, and the desperate collective agreement never to say out loud that the money was gone. They looked down on me, the plumber, from the deck of a ship that was already sinking, and they didn't even know it was sinking or wouldn't let themselves know, and I could see the waterline from where I stood, down at the far end of the table, because a man who has actually built something from nothing can always tell the difference between real money and the performance of it, and the Ellsworths were the finest performance of money I have ever seen. I built something real, meanwhile, in those same years, and they never noticed because they had already decided what I was and stopped looking. I took my 3 trucks and I grew them patiently the way you grow a real thing into Marchetti Mechanical, a company that did the heating and cooling and plumbing and mechanical systems for hospitals and universities and office towers, hundreds of employees, the kind of unglamorous essential work that the whole modern world runs on and that no one thinks about until it fails. I want to say something about that work because the Ellsworths spent 28 years treating it as beneath them, and I have come to believe it is very nearly the opposite. The Ellsworth fortune, whatever it had once been, was made so long ago that not one living Ellsworth had any idea how, and they lived on it the way you live on a language you've forgotten you're speaking, and it made them, every one of them, fundamentally helpless because they had never once in their lives made a thing or fixed a thing or built a thing or met a payroll or solved a real problem with their own hands and minds. My work was the opposite of that. When a hospital systems fail at 3 in the morning, when the thing that keeps the operating room sterile and the patient's breathing goes down, nobody calls an Ellsworth. They call people like me and my men, and we come in the middle of the night and we fix the actual physical world so that actual human lives can continue. And there is a dignity in that, a real and unshakable dignity, that no amount of inherited money can buy and no amount of contempt can diminish. I built a company full of men like my father, pipefitters and welders and mechanics, men with calloused hands and mortgages and pride, and I paid them well and treated them as the skilled professionals they were, and together we did work that mattered, that held up the invisible infrastructure of thousands of people's lives, and I was prouder of that company than I could ever have been of a name I'd merely inherited. The Ellsworths thought the pipe business was a punchline. The pipe business put my daughter through college, funded a life of real substance, and, when the moment came, turned out to be the only thing standing between the great Ellsworth family and the street. There is a lesson in that about which kinds of work are actually beneath people, and it is the reverse of what the Ellsworths believed, because the work that is truly beneath a person is the work of doing nothing while looking down on those who do everything, and no Ellsworth ever once recognized that they were the only ones in any room doing that particular job. I made real money, Joe Marchetti money, cash money, the kind you earn and keep and understand, and I did it without ever once mentioning it at an Ellsworth dinner, because I had learned that the surest way to keep them comfortable in their contempt was to let them keep believing I was still the plumber with 3 trucks, and I had also learned, more importantly, that a man who has to announce his worth to a room doesn't have much, and a man who actually has it doesn't need to. So I let them sneer. I sat at the far end of the table, the plumber, worth many times what the whole sinking Ellsworth estate was worth, and I said nothing, and I built, and I waited, though I did not know then what I was waiting for. And then, 10 years ago, I found out what I was waiting for because Edmund Ellsworth, the man who told me I would never be family, came to me in secret and asked me to save him. I need to tell you how that happened, because it is the heart of everything. It was a Tuesday and I got a call at my office, and it was Edmund, which had never happened, not once in 18 years of marriage at that point. Edmund had never called me, and his voice was strange, tight, and he asked if he could come to see me at my office privately, and he asked me, Edmund Ellsworth asked me not to mention it to Kate. And he came, and he sat across the desk from me in my unglamorous office at Marchetti Mechanical, surrounded by the evidence of the real company I'd built that he'd never bothered to see, and I watched the proudest man I had ever known do the single hardest thing I ever saw him do, which was ask me for help. Graymore was going to be lost. The bank was going to foreclose. The family firm had finally collapsed under a century of coasting, The debts had come due all at once, and Edmund Ellsworth, who had spent 18 years making sure I knew I was beneath him, had run out of every other option and every other person, and had come, at last, in secret, in shame, to the plumber because I was the only person he knew with real money who might do it quietly, for Kate's sake, without destroying the family in the telling. I want you to picture that meeting, because it is one of the strangest hours of my life. Edmund Ellsworth, 70 years old, in a suit that had been expensive a decade earlier, sitting in a plastic chair across from my metal desk, in an office that smelled faintly of solder and coffee, with the noise of the shop coming through the walls, the actual sounds of actual work of the exact kind he'd spent 18 years teaching me to be ashamed of. And I watched him take it in, the plaques on my wall from the hospital systems and the universities, the scale of the operation humming around him, and I watched the first crack of understanding move across his face, the dawning comprehension that the plumber he'd dismissed had built something vastly larger and more solid than anything the Ellsworths still had, and I watched him hate that comprehension even as he needed it. He couldn't quite look at me. He looked at a point over my shoulder, and in a voice stripped of all its usual frost, a voice I'd never heard from him, he laid it out: the debts, the foreclosure, the collapse of the family firm, the imminent loss of Graymore, and then he stopped because he physically could not, form the sentence that came next, the sentence asking me for help, and we sat there in silence while the proudest man I knew tried to make his mouth say a thing his whole life had trained it never to say. And I did something then that I have never told anyone until now. I made it easy for him. I could have made him say it. I could have made him beg, made him grovel, made him earn, in that chair, 1 ounce of the humiliation he'd handed me for 18 years. And instead I said, before he could force the words out, "Edmund, it's already done. Kate's not going to lose her home. Tell me what the number is and it's handled, and we never have to talk about it again." Because I looked at that old man drowning in his own pride, and I understood that watching him beg would have made me feel powerful for about 10 seconds and would have made me smaller forever, and I did not want to buy 10 seconds of power at the price of my own soul. So I spared him. I spared the man who had never once spared me. And do you know what he did in that moment when I handed him his rescue and his dignity in the same breath? He nodded once stiffly and he said, "See that it stays between us." And he stood up and he left, and he did not say thank you, and he went home to Graymore that I had just saved, and he did not tell his wife or his children. And at the next family dinner 3 weeks later, he seated me at the far end of the table and introduced me to a guest as Catherine's husband. He's in plumbing. And I understood, sitting there, that I had saved this man's entire world, and it had not made him kinder to me. It had made him crueler, because now on top of everything else he owed me, and a man like Edmund could not bear a debt to a man like me, and the only way he could carry it was to press down harder on me, to reassure himself, through my diminishment, that the natural order he believed in had not actually just been inverted in a plastic chair in a plumber's office. That is the thing about the truly proud. Do them a great enough kindness and they will never forgive you for it. And here is the thing that I think tells you everything about who I am and who they were. I said yes. I didn't make him beg. I didn't extract a pound of flesh. I didn't even make him say thank you, because I could see what it was costing him just to be sitting there. And I am not a cruel man, whatever the next part of this story might make you wish I had been. I quietly paid off the debts. I bought the mortgage on Graymore from the bank so that the family could keep their home, so that Kate would never have to watch her childhood destroyed, so that the Ellsworth name would not become, overnight, a public bankruptcy. I saved them. I saved all of them, the whole cold, contemptuous lot of them, and I did it for my wife, and I asked for nothing, and Edmund's one condition, the only thing he demanded even as I was rescuing him, was that no one could ever know. Not Kate. Not Bradford. Not Cordelia. No one. His pride could survive being saved by the plumber only if the plumber's role remained a secret he carried alone. And I agreed. God help me, I agreed, because I understood that shame, and because I loved his daughter, and because some part of me, the part my mother put there, wanted to be the bigger man, even to a man who would never know I was being it. So for 10 years I held the mortgage on Graymore. For 10 years the Ellsworths lived in a house I owned, ate at a table I had saved, wore a name I had personally kept out of the bankruptcy courts, and for 10 years they went right on treating me like the help, because Edmund never told them, and I never told them, and only 2 people on this earth knew that the plumber they looked down on was the reason they still had a roof, and one of those 2 people was about to die, and take his half of the secret with him and leave me holding the whole truth alone at a funeral where they would seat me, one final time, with the caterers. I want to tell you what those 10 years were actually like carrying that, because it is a strange and specific weight and I have never described it to anyone. Every family gathering, for 10 years, I sat at the far end of the table in a house I owned, and I listened to Bradford make his little jokes and Genevieve refuse to use my name and the whole family perform their superiority over me. And I knew the entire time that every roof beam over their heads existed because of a check I had written, that the very china they ate off was in a house that would have been sold at auction if not for the plumber they were condescending to between courses. And I never said a word. Not once. Not when Bradford was at his worst, not when Genevieve was at her coldest, not even in the privacy of my own heart did I let myself use it as a comfort because I had promised, and because using it, even silently, felt like it would cheapen the thing I had done, would turn a gift into a transaction I was keeping score on. So I carried it clean. And I will be honest with you, there were nights it nearly broke me. Nights I lay awake next to Kate wanting so badly to tell her, to let her know that her husband was not the failure her family painted, that he had in fact saved them all, wanting the simple human relief of being known by the one person I most wanted to be known by. And I didn't tell even her for 10 years because Edmund's condition had been absolute and a promise is a promise even to a man who doesn't deserve one. And because, if I'm honest, some part of me wanted to be the kind of man who could carry it alone, who didn't need the credit, who could do the right thing in the dark and let it stay dark. I don't know if that made me strong or foolish. Kate would later tell me, when she finally learned all of it, that it made me both, and that she was furious I'd carried it alone and prouder of me than she'd ever been, in the same breath. But those 10 years taught me something about the difference between a gift and a debt, which is that the moment you start keeping score, a gift becomes a debt, and a debt curdles the soul of everyone attached to it, and that the only way to give someone something truly is to give it in a way that asks nothing back, not even acknowledgement, not even the small warm coin of being thanked. I gave the Ellsworths 10 years of their own home and asked nothing, and it cost me more than the money ever did, and it is the thing I am, in the end, most quietly proud of, because any man with money can write a check, but it takes something else entirely to write it, hand it over, and then go sit at the far end of the table and say nothing while the people you saved laugh at you. If you have listened this far, let me stop and ask you the question I sat with in the back pew at Edmund Ellsworth's funeral, wearing the black suit, watching a family that did not know what I had done for them grieve a man who did, and who had died without ever once saying thank you. When you have quietly carried people who despise you, saved them at your own expense and asked nothing, and then watched them go right on despising you because they never even knew, what do you owe them when the truth is finally about to come out? Do you owe them rescue, again, out of the same grace? Or is there a point where grace becomes something else, becomes the thing that lets cruel people stay cruel because they never face a single consequence? I did not know the answer that day. Tell me in the comments what you think a man owes people like that. Because the reading of the will was 3 days away, and the truth was about to come out whether I willed it or not, and I was going to have to decide, in front of all of them, what kind of man a lifetime of their contempt had actually made me. Let me tell you about Edmund's death, because there is one more thing that happened, a private thing that complicates everything I felt, and I have to tell it to you honestly even though it would be a cleaner story without it. 3 weeks before he died, when everyone knew it was close, Edmund asked for me. Just me. Not Kate, not Bradford, not Cordelia, not Genevieve. Me. And I went, and I sat by the bed of the man who had told me 28 years earlier that I would never be family. And he was small now, the way the dying gets small, the great cold pride of him worn down to something almost human. And for a long while he didn't speak, and then he did, and what he said is a thing I have turned over in my mind every day since. He said, "You never told her. All these years. You never told Catherine what I did, what you did. I watched you not tell her. I kept waiting for you to use it, to hold it over this family, to make me pay in front of them. Any other man would have. You never did." And I said, quietly, that I'd made him a promise. And Edmund closed his eyes, and something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. And he said, "I know what you are, Joe. I've known for 10 years. You're the only one who ever gave this family anything that wasn't taken from somebody else first. And I couldn't stand it. Do you understand? I could bear being poor. I could not bear being saved by you, because it meant that everything I believed about who was better than whom was a lie, and I was too old and too proud to survive knowing it. So I punished you for saving me. I've known that too, the whole time." He was quiet a moment, and then he said the closest thing to an apology that a man like Edmund Ellsworth was capable of, which was not an apology at all, but was, from him, an earthquake. He said, "I'm leaving them nothing but debt and a name I spent. When I'm gone, They'll turn to you because there's no one else, and they won't even know they've done it before. You can let them fall, Joe. You've earned that. No one on this earth would blame you. I certainly wouldn't. And then he opened his eyes and looked at me and he said, "But I think you won't. I think you're a better man than every Ellsworth who ever lived, including the one lying in this bed. And I think that's the thing I could never forgive you for. Now get out. And thank you." There. I said it once. Don't expect it in writing. That was the last real conversation I ever had with my father-in-law. He never said it in writing, but he said it once, and from Edmund, once was more than he'd given anyone in his life. I walked out of that bedroom and I sat in my car in the Graymore Drive for a long time before I could drive, because I did not know what to do with what had just happened to me. For 28 years I had built my dignity on a simple, clean foundation, which was that Edmund Ellsworth was a cold, small man and I was better than him and I knew it, and that clarity had gotten me through everything. And in 5 minutes on his deathbed he had complicated it beyond repair, because he had seen me, finally, truly seen me, had named exactly what I was and exactly what he was and exactly why he'd done what he'd done. And a man who can do that, who can look at his own cruelty with that much clarity at the end, is not simply a small man. He is something sadder and more human than that, a man who knew better and could not do better, trapped his whole life in a pride he understood and could not escape. And I found, sitting in that car, that I could not hate him cleanly anymore, and that the loss of my clean hatred was its own strange grief, because clean hatred is comfortable and what he'd left me with instead was pity, and pity is much heavier to carry than contempt. He had, with his last real act, taken even my hatred from me and left me with the harder thing, which was understanding. I have come to think that was the only gift Edmund knew how to give, the terrible gift of being fully seen by someone, and that he gave it to me on his deathbed because it was the only currency he had left and the only debt he knew how to pay. It was not enough. 28 years, and a deathbed thank you is not enough, and I will not pretend it was. But it was not nothing either, and I have stopped needing it to be either one because people are not equations that resolve, they are just people, and Edmund Ellsworth was a proud, cruel man who saw me clearly once, at the end, and both of those things are true, and I have made my peace with holding them together. So I grieved him, complicatedly, the way you grieve a man who wounded you for decades and then, at the very end, saw you, truly saw you, for the first and only time. And then we buried him, and 3 days later the family gathered in the great drawing room at Graymore for the reading of the will, and I took my seat at the back, and the lawyer, a dusty old creature named Mr. Pruitt who had served the Ellsworths for 40 years, began to read, and he came to the line about me, and the family smiled, and you already know what the line said because I told you at the start. To my daughter's husband, I leave nothing, as he has always been so very proud of making his own way. Edmund had written that will years before our conversation, before the end softened him, and he had not changed it, whether from forgetfulness or a final flicker of the old pride I will never know, and so the last public word from Edmund Ellsworth to the room was one more insult to the plumber, and the family drank it in and smiled, and Kate went white and gripped my hand, and I kept my face still, because in about 10 minutes Mr. Pruitt was going to reach the part of the will that Edmund had. Not written as an insult, the part about the actual estate, and I knew what was in it, and they did not. Because here is what the reading of the will revealed, in Mr. Pruitt's dry, uncomfortable voice, to a family that had gathered to divide a fortune. There was no fortune. Mr. Pruitt, visibly wishing he were anywhere else, walked the room through the actual financial condition of the Ellsworth estate, and I watched the smiles curdle one by one as it dawned on them, slowly, then all at once, that the great Ellsworth wealth was a corpse that had been standing up only because no one had yet pushed it over. The family firm was worthless. The accounts were nearly empty. And Graymore, the ancestral estate, the stone monument to their superiority, the house they were sitting in at that very moment, was mortgaged in full, and the mortgage was held not by a bank but by a private entity, and the estate did not have remotely enough to pay it, which meant that the house they had gathered to inherit was not theirs to inherit at all. It belonged, in every way that a foreclosure would soon make brutally clear, to whoever held that mortgage. And Bradford, my brother-in-law, who had asked me how the pipe business was for 28 years, said, in a voice climbing toward panic, Who holds it? We'll deal with them, we'll negotiate. Who is it? And Mr. Pruitt looked down at his papers, and then he looked, with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, at the back of the room, at me, and he said, The mortgage on Graymore is held by a company called Kestrel Holdings. Its owner is Mr. Marchetti. And the entire family turned, all of them, in a single slow motion, to look at the plumber at the back of the room, the one who had just been left nothing, the one they had smiled at, and I watched 28 years of contempt collide, in real time, with the truth, and I did not smile, because I am not Bradford. But I will not pretend to you that something in me did not go very still and very calm. The calm of a man who has waited a long time for a room to finally see him. I want to describe what happened on their faces in that moment, because I had 28 years invested in that room and I read every face in it as the truth arrived. Bradford went from panic to confusion to a dawning, sickening comprehension, and I watched him replay. I could see it happening behind his eyes. 28 years of how's the pipe business, Joe? 28 years of the soft smile and the empty scotch glass, and understand, all at once, that the man he had been condescending to had been quietly holding the roof over his head for a decade, and that every single one of those little jokes had been made by a man who owed his home to their target. Genevieve did something worse and quieter. Genevieve did not panic. Genevieve simply went gray, and still, because Genevieve understood faster than the others, understood not just the financial catastrophe but the total collapse of the story of her life, the story in which the Ellsworths were superior and I was the help, and I watched that story die in her eyes in real time, and I watched her understand that she had spent 28 years failing to use the name of the one person who had saved her family. And there was no cruelty I could have inflicted that would have equaled what that knowledge did to her on its own. And Cordelia, my sister-in-law, put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled, and I could not tell yet whether it was fear for herself or shame at what she suddenly understood about all of them. Though I would learn later it was the beginning of the second thing. And Kate, my Kate, beside me, gripping my hand, Kate began quietly to cry, and they were not the white-faced tears of shame she'd cried for 28 years in that house. They were something else. They were the tears of a woman watching the truth about her husband finally fill a room that had spent 3 decades refusing to see it, and she turned to me, and through the tears she was almost smiling, because some long, unbearable weight was coming off her right there in front of everyone. And that look on my wife's face was the moment I had never known I was waiting for. The moment all the quiet years had been building toward, and it was worth more than the deed to Graymore and everything the Ellsworths had ever owned. If you have made it this far, let me ask you the question that hung in the air of that drawing room, because it is the question the whole story had been building toward, and it is not a simple one. I held the deed to their world. I could foreclose and take Graymore, and let the Ellsworths discover what it is to be as poor and as unimportant as they had always treated me, and there would have been a justice in it so clean and so complete that part of me, the part that had sat at the far end of the table for 28 years, sang out for it. Or I could save them, again as I had saved them before, and be, one more time, the bigger man to people who had never once been big to me, and risk that my grace would simply reset the whole cruel machine and let them go on being exactly what they were. Justice or grace. The clean satisfaction of letting them fall, or the harder, murkier mercy of catching them again. And this time, unlike 10 years ago, it would not be a secret. This time, whatever I chose, they would know. Tell me in the comments what you would have done. Standing at the back of that room, holding the deed to the house of the people who spent your whole marriage making you feel like nothing. Because I made my choice, and it surprised even me, and it was not entirely mercy, and it was not entirely justice, and I think it was the truest thing I ever did. I stood up. I remember that the room was completely silent, and that for the first time in 28 years, every Ellsworth in it was looking at me and actually seeing me, waiting on me, because for the first time in 28 years I was the one who mattered. I was the one the whole room's fate hung on, and the reversal of it was so total that I could see them struggling to even hold it in their minds. And I did not gloat. I want to tell you that clearly because I know some of you wanted me to, and I understand why. But my mother's voice was in that room with me. Small is a thing you agree to, don't agree, and I understood that gloating would have been agreeing finally, to be as small as they had always tried to make me, and I would not give them that. I would not let 28 years of their contempt turn me, in my one moment of triumph, into a version of them. So I did not gloat. Instead, I told them the truth, all of it, calmly, in front of everyone. I told them that Graymore had nearly been lost 10 years ago, that Edmund had come to me in secret, that I had paid the debts and bought the mortgage and saved the family home and the family name, and that I had done it for Kate, and that I had kept it secret for a decade because Edmund's pride required it, and that they had all been living, this entire time, in a house the plumber had saved. And I watched that land. I watched Bradford, who had never worked a day, understand that the man he'd condescended to for 28 years had quietly been carrying him the whole time. I watched Genevieve, who had never once used my name, understand what her family had actually been and what I had actually been, and I watched the icy architecture of her superiority crack right there, because there is no surviving for a person like Genevieve the discovery that the one you look down on was the one holding you up. Bradford, of course, tried to bluster, because bluster was the only tool Bradford had ever owned. Even then, even standing in the wreckage of everything, with the truth laid bare in front of him, he tried to find the angle that would let him keep his superiority, and he said, his voice shaking, "This is absurd. You what bought our debt? Behind our backs? So this was your plan all along? Worm your way in and take the estate? I always knew there was something calculating about you." And the room flinched, because even they could hear how grotesque it was. The man reaching for a way to make his rescuer the villain. And I let it hang there a moment, and then I said quietly, "Bradford, I saved your home 10 years ago and never told a soul, and asked for nothing, and let your father go on humiliating me at every dinner because his pride needed it, and I did it for Kate and for no other reason. If I'd wanted to take Graymore, I could have taken it a decade ago at the foreclosure auction, for far less than I paid to save it, and you'd never have known my name was on it. I didn't. I saved it and I gave it back to you to live in, and I said nothing. Think for 1 second before you call the man who's kept you housed for 10 years calculating. The only thing I calculated was how to help your family without your father having to admit he'd been wrong about me. That was the only scheme, Bradford. Sparing your father the truth you're all learning right now." And Bradford had nothing, because there was nothing, and the bluster went out of him like air from a punctured thing, and he sat down. And that was the end of Bradford as a force in that room, the end of 28 years of soft smiling superiority, deflated in a single exchange by the simple weight of the truth, and I felt no triumph in it, only the quiet of a long overdue thing finally settling into place. And then I told them what I had decided, and this is the part one I'm proudest of, because it was neither the cruelty they deserved nor the blind grace that would have let them off. I told them that I was not going to throw them out of Graymore, but I told them that the fantasy was over. The estate was insolvent, and I now owned it in all but name, and I was going to settle it honestly, which meant the truth of the family's finances would no longer be hidden behind performance and pride. I would keep Graymore because it was my wife's childhood home, and I would not take that from Kate, but it would be kept the way I keep things, honestly, and paid for by the man who had actually earned the money, which was me, and the family would live in it, if they chose to, not as lords of an estate they no longer owned, but as people being extended a kindness by a man they had spent their lives despising, and they would have to sit with that every day in every room, which was a more exact justice than foreclosure could ever have been. And I told Bradford specifically that the allowance the family firm had paid him his whole life to do nothing was gone, that there was no more money to be idle on, and that if he wanted to eat he was going to have to do the one thing no Ellsworth had done in 4 generations, which was work, and that if he ever wanted to learn how, unlikely as it seemed, my company was always hiring, and I would start him at the bottom, with the other men, and he could find out what the pipe business was actually like. He did not take me up on it. I did not expect him to, but I wanted it said, in front of everyone, that the door the plumber offered was more than any Ellsworth had ever offered the plumber. Let me tell you why I chose what I chose, because I have thought about it a great deal since, and I think the reasoning matters more than the choice. I could have foreclosed. It would have been just. No court, no priest, no honest person alive would have said I owed the Ellsworths anything but the back of my hand after 28 years. And there is a version of this story where I do exactly that, where I take Graymore and sell it and let them scatter to whatever small apartments their nothing could afford, and that version has a clean, bright satisfaction to it that I would be lying if I said I didn't feel the pull of. But here is what I understood, standing in that drawing room with the power to ruin them. Justice would have felt magnificent for about a week, and then I would have had to live the rest of my life as a man who, when he finally got the power, used it to destroy a grieving family, including a mother-in-law in her 80s and a sister-in-law who had done me no worse than laugh at bad jokes. And I would have had to look at my daughter, who had watched me my whole life, and show her that the lesson of the story was that when the small people finally get power, they become as cruel as the people who had power before. I did not want to teach Lucy that. I did not want to be that. My mother did not raise that. So I chose the third thing, the thing that was neither the blind grace that lets cruelty off the hook nor the clean cruelty that would have made me one of them. I chose accountability without destruction. I made them face the truth, fully, publicly, which they had spent decades avoiding, and I stripped away the delusions and the free ride and the story of their own superiority, which needed to go, but I did not put anyone in the street because putting people in the street is not justice. It is just power wearing justice's coat. And I have come to believe that this is the hardest and highest thing a wronged person can do, harder than forgiveness and harder than revenge, which is to hold someone fully accountable while refusing to destroy them, to make them face what they did without becoming, in the facing, the thing they were. Most people can manage revenge and a few saints can manage forgiveness, but the narrow road between them, accountability without cruelty, is the one almost nobody walks, and it is the only one, I think, that lets you win without losing yourself. I tried to walk it. I hope I did. My name is Joe Marchetti. Let me tell you how it landed, and then let me tell you the one thing I learned that I most want you to carry. The person it landed on hardest and best was Kate, my wife, because you have to understand what those 28 years had cost her quietly, in a way I could see even when she couldn't. Kate had chosen me, and she had never once regretted choosing me. But choosing me had meant absorbing, for almost 3 decades, her own family's steady message that she had married down, married wrong, embarrassed them, and no matter how much she loved me and knew her own choice was right, a person cannot stand in that particular rain for 28 years without some of it soaking in, some small voice of doubt her family had planted and watered at every holiday. And what happened in that drawing room did something for Kate that I could never have done for her with all the love in the world. Because it was not my love that vindicated her choice, it was the truth, revealed in front of the very people who had spent her life telling her she'd chosen wrong. In one afternoon, my wife watched her family discover that the man she'd chosen, the man they'd taught her to feel faintly ashamed of, was the one holding the whole family up, was the only person in her bloodline with both the means and the decency to matter when it counted. And I watched something lift off my wife that afternoon that had been pressing down on her for 28 years, and she came and stood beside me at the front of that room, beside the plumber, in front of all of them, and she took my arm, and she was not white with shame anymore. She was something I had rarely gotten to see in that house. She was proud, openly, defiantly proud of me, of the life we'd built that they'd all been too blind to see, and if I had foreclosed and taken Graymore and left them in the street, I would not have gotten that moment, that lifting, that pride, and it was worth more than the house and everything in it. I need you to understand the full price Kate had paid, because it is the part of this that even I underestimated for most of our marriage. When a woman like Kate defies her family to marry a man like me, the family does not disown her outright, because outright disowning would be a scandal, and the Ellsworths feared scandal above all. Instead, they do something crueler and quieter. They keep her, but they keep her diminished. They let her stay in the family while making sure she understands, at every gathering, in 1,000 small ways, that she has disappointed them, lowered herself, chosen wrong. And a person can withstand that for a year or 5, but Kate withstood it for 28, and I watched, over those decades, the way it wore at her, the way she would go quiet and small in that house in a way she never was anywhere else, the way a single visit to Graymore could dim her for days afterward, and I understood that her family had never stopped punishing her for choosing me, and that every ounce of contempt they aimed at me was also, by design, aimed at her, a constant low message. That her love had been a mistake. She never once wavered in that love, not for a second, but you cannot absorb that message for 28 years without it leaving marks, and Kate carried marks, invisible ones, that I could see even when she couldn't, a small permanent flinch, a readiness to be found wanting. And what the truth did in that drawing room, what no amount of my loving her had ever quite been able to do, was reach back across 28 years and unsay the message. Because in that moment her family did not just discover my worth, they discovered that Kate had been right all along, right about me, right about what matters, righter than all of them about the deepest question a person can be right or wrong about, which is where real value lies. Her whole family, in one afternoon, was revealed to have been wrong about the central choice of her life, and she was revealed to have been right, and I watched 28 years of that low, cruel message finally lose its power over my wife, and she stood up straight beside me, and she has stood up straight ever since. Freeing Kate from that was the truest thing the whole reckoning accomplished. Everything else was money and houses. That was a soul handed back its full size. And my daughter Lucy, who was 24 by then and had grown up absorbing the same cool condescension aimed at her Marchetti half, got to watch her father be revealed as the substance of a family that had treated him as the stain. And I will tell you that a child seeing that, seeing the parent who was quietly disrespected turn out to be the one who mattered, and seeing him handle it with dignity instead of vengeance, is a thing that reshapes how that child understands the whole world. What's worth respecting, what's worth being. Lucy said to me that night, "You could have destroyed them, Dad. Everybody would have understood. Why didn't you?" And I told her what my mother told me, that small is a thing you agree to, and that the Ellsworths had spent their whole lives agreeing to be small in the one way that actually mattered, small of character, small of spirit, and that I was not going to travel 28 years just to arrive at the finish at the same smallness they'd started with. I told her that the best revenge on people who think they're better than you is not to ruin them, it's to be, plainly and undeniably and in front of everyone, the better person, and to let that be the thing they can never take back and never match. Lucy has lived differently since that day. She married a good man last year, a carpenter, a maker of things, and when someone at the wedding, some remnant of the old Ellsworth world, made a small remark about her marrying a tradesman, my Lucy laughed out loud and said, "It runs in the family. Best men I know. And I have never been prouder of anything in my life." The Ellsworths themselves scattered, each according to their nature, the way people do when the thing that held them together turns out to have been a lie. Genevieve, my mother-in-law, never recovered, not because she lost the money, but because she lost the story of Ellsworth's superiority that had been the entire scaffolding of herself, and without it she simply folded inward, a woman who discovered at the end of her life that the thing she'd looked down on was the thing that had been carrying her, and who could not survive the knowledge. I did not enjoy that. I thought I would, and I didn't, because there is no pleasure, in the end, in watching pride collapse, only a kind of solemn recognition of how heavy and how hollow it always was. Bradford, freed at last from the allowance that had let him do nothing, floundered and blustered, and blamed everyone but himself, and drifted into a smaller and smaller life, because a man who reaches 50 having never once been useful cannot easily learn it, and I did not save him from that, because some things a person has to save himself from, and it would have been no kindness to deny him the one hard lesson that might, even now, make something of him. But Cordelia surprised me. My sister-in-law, who had laughed her practiced little laugh at my expense for 28 years, came to me a few months after the will, alone, and she did the thing no other Ellsworth had ever done, which was apologize, really apologize, without excuse. She said she had been raised to believe a lie about what makes a person worth respecting, and that she had believed it because believing it was easier than examining it, and that watching what I'd done and how I'd done it had broken the lie open for her, too late to undo her part in it but not too late to be sorry. And she asked, not for money, not for rescue, but whether it was too late to actually know me after all these years. And I told her it was not too late, because I am my mother's son and my mother did not raise a man who turns away the one person willing to change, and Cordelia and I are, improbably, something like friends now, the only real bridge to survive the wreck of that family, and she is proof of a thing I have come to believe, which is that contempt is usually not evil, it is usually just inherited and unexamined, and that some people, when the truth finally makes them look at it, are brave enough to put it down, and those people can be redeemed, and are worth redeeming. I'll tell you the small thing Cordelia did that convinced me she meant it, because talk is cheap and I've heard a lifetime of Ellsworth talk. A few months after that first apology, Cordelia asked if she could take Lucy to lunch. Just the two of them, my daughter and the aunt who had spent Lucy's whole childhood treating her as half a person. And I was wary, I'll admit it, but I let it happen, and I later learned that Cordelia had spent that lunch apologizing to my daughter, a 24-year-old, for how the family had treated her when she was a little girl, for the only half and the cousins in the bottom of the staircase, and telling Lucy that she had been wrong, that the family had been wrong, that Lucy was worth more than any of them and always had been. She didn't have to do that. There was nothing in it for her, no money, no rescue, no audience, just a woman trying to repair, one small honest conversation at a time, the specific harm she'd been part of. And a person who will seek out the child she wronged and apologize to her when no one is watching and nothing is to be gained is a person who has actually changed, not just a person who got caught, and that is the whole difference, and it is why Cordelia sits at my table now, a real guest, using my name while the rest of them scattered. Redemption is real, but it has a signature, and the signature is amends made in private with nothing to gain, and Cordelia signed it, and I honored it, because a man who won't accept a true apology is just cruelty wearing patience's coat, and I did not travel 28 years to arrive at that either. I kept Graymore. It's mine now, honestly mine, paid for with Plumber's money, and Kate and I spend time there, and it's a different house than it was, warmer, because the cold thing that ran it is gone. I hung one new picture in the portrait gallery, among all the painted Ellsworths looking down their noses at the centuries. It's a photograph of my mother, the cleaning woman in her good dress, the one she wore to my wedding, the woman who told me that dignity is carried and not inherited and that small is a thing you agree to. She hangs there now among the aristocrats, my mother the cleaning woman, and she has more nobility in that one photograph than the whole painted gallery of Ellsworths combined. And every time I walk past her I tip an imaginary hat, because she was right about everything, and she lived to be right about none of it, and hanging her there is the closest I can come to telling her that the small boy she raised did not, in the end, agree to be small. Sometimes I bring Lucy to Graymore and we stand in front of that photograph together, the two of us, and I tell her about her great-grandmother, Antonia, who crossed an ocean with nothing and scrubbed floors on her knees and raised 4 children alone and never once bent her spine, and who now hangs in a gallery of people who would not have let her in the servants' entrance, looking more like the real aristocrat than any of them, because she was. And I tell Lucy that this is what we come from, not the Ellsworths on the walls but the woman among them who didn't belong there according to everyone except the truth, and that the blood in her veins is Antonia's blood, the blood of people who built and fixed and carried and refused to be made small, and that it is the finest bloodline I know, worth more than any name on any portrait. And Lucy looks up at her great-grandmother, the cleaning woman among the lords, and I watch her stand a little straighter, the way she stood straighter at 9 going up those stairs, and I know that whatever else I did or failed to do in that cold house over 28 years, I got that one thing right. I got my daughter to understand where real nobility comes from, and it does not come from a frame on a wall, it comes from a spine that will not bend, and we have those in my family going back generations, and they were never for sale at any price the Ellsworths could have paid. My name is Joe Marchetti, and here is the one thing I learned, and I want to give it to you plainly because I think a great many of you need it. They will tell you, some of them in 1,000 small ways, that you are beneath them, because of where you came from or what you do with your hands or how you talk or the money you don't have or the name you weren't born with. And it will be tempting over the years, if the contempt is patient and constant enough, to half believe it, to let it soak in, to accept the seat at the far end of the table as the seat you deserve. Do not agree. That is the whole of it, that is everything I know, condensed into the thing my mother said in a rented hall 40 years ago. The people who look down on others are almost always standing on borrowed ground, on inherited money they didn't earn or inherited status they didn't build or a story about their own superiority that has never once been tested by anything real. And the day the real thing comes, the crisis, the loss, the moment that requires actual substance, you find out fast who was aristocracy and who was just expensive, and it is, so often, the one they seated with the caterers who turns out to be the only one in the room with anything solid underneath. Class is not character. Breeding is not worth. A name is not a spine. And dignity, real dignity, the kind that survives 28 years of contempt without curdling into either surrender or cruelty, is not something you are born into or purchase or marry. It is something you carry, and keep, and refuse no matter what to set down. I carried mine through that whole cold house for 28 years, and on the day it finally counted, it was the only thing in the room still standing, because it was the only thing in the room that had ever been real. So let me leave you with the question I have carried since that day in the drawing room, and let me ask it plainly. If the people who spent your whole life looking down on you, who never once treated you as good enough, suddenly found themselves needing you, holding out their hands to the very person they despised, what would you do? Would you let them fall and call it justice? Would you save them and call it grace? Or would you do what I tried to do, which is refuse to become small in your moment of power, and be, plainly and finally, the bigger person, not for their sake but for your own, because the best answer to people who think they're better than you is simply to be better, in the one way that actually counts. Tell me in the comments, because I think there are more of us than anyone knows, the ones who married up or worked our way in or came from the wrong side of something, sitting at the far end of tables right now, being made to feel small, and they need to hear from you that the contempt of small people is not a verdict on your worth, it's a confession of theirs. I spent 28 years being looked down on by people who were standing on nothing. Don't agree to be small. It's the only thing they can't take from you, and it turns out to be the only thing that was ever worth having. My mother knew that, scrubbing other people's floors with her chin up. She was the richest person I ever knew, and she never had a dime, and she hangs in a gallery of aristocrats now, looking more like nobility than any of them, because she understood the one thing all their money never bought, which is that you are exactly as big as you refuse to agree to be small.